I'm Lisa Fine, and I'm one of the co-hosts of the Great Women in Compliance podcast. You are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report. Check out Great Women in Compliance on the Compliance Podcast Network, and it posts every Wednesday at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. You can also join in the conversation at the GWIC community on LinkedIn as well.
In this episode, I have back fan favorite Mike DeBernardis. Mike is a partner at Hughes Hubbard. We take a look at key enforcement actions and issues from Q2 of 2021. I know you will enjoy it. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and we're in for a real treat today because we have Professor Karen Woody with us. Karen, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. I'm always happy to be here.
And that's, I think, Associate Professor at WNL. Along the educational lines, we're about to begin a new semester in August. What are you going to be teaching in fall 2021?
That's a great question. And we will be back in person, I hope, if everything goes according to plan. This fall, I will be teaching torts. So the sort of first semester, first day of law school to the incoming 1Ls. So that's one of my classes. And the other class, sort of the other side of the spectrum of law school, I guess if you could say upper level course on insider trading. So I'll see both ends of sort of beginning and end of law school for some students.
Well, my claim to fame at the University of Michigan School of Law is I was the first person called on the first class of the first day. And that was the highlight of my law school career, and it was all downhill after there. So good luck to the first person who gets called on.
Exactly.
Well, Karen, I've been wanting to visit with you about kind of where the Securities and Exchange Commission is now, and I recognize we're still into the early part of the new administration, particularly for some of the agencies and commissions. But maybe start with some of your early impressions of the SEC. One of the things that, frankly, I've enjoyed a little bit more is I've seen a fair amount of debate by SEC commissioners in the public arena. And is that something that's been going on all along? Is it more now, less now, or is it something different?
I do think it's a little bit different right now than what we've seen in the past, at least historically. What it is, the SEC commissioners are appointed, and there are 5 commissioners, and they are appointed by virtue of what their political affiliation is. So that right there already sets us up for an interesting dynamic among the commissioners themselves. And typically, it's the political affiliation hasn't really played much of a role, if any, among the commissioners. But, there obviously is knowledge that certain commissioners are affiliated with certain political parties, and the administration obviously would have 3 commissioners from the sitting administration's party, and the other 2 from the other political party. And that, like I said, hasn't been something that has made waves or really is acknowledged all that much. And there certainly are times where one would have to guess which political party some of these commissioners affiliate with. But that has seemed to be a little bit in the past, certainly since the Trump administration, but arguably maybe before that somewhat. As these debates have become sort of more along political lines at the commission, I think we see commissioners really break. What feels a little different now is they are more vocal about the break. It's not simply the votes are 3-2. There's been sort of published dissents and certain things where commissioners are being a little more vocal about their disagreements among the commissioners. And that's, I think, a little bit of a new thing. I mean, not too long ago, there was one commissioner who had been an advisor for commissioners of different parties in different administrations. And I don't think you would find that now. I do think there really would be more of a political litmus test for you to work for one commissioner or another, which I think is too bad.
Well, Karen, Chairman Gary Gensler has been in that position probably, I think, for 4 months now. Do you have any early impressions of either Chairman Gensler or where he may want to take the commission, or is it really just too early to tell at this point?
Well, I don't actually think it's too early to tell for Gensler in particular, because he's not a Johnny-come-lately to D.C. by any stretch of the imagination. He previously was chairman of the CFTC under Obama, and before that, he had a few roles at the Treasury Department, both as undersecretary for domestic finance and assistant secretary for financial markets. So he's certainly not new to DC and to sort of this political role in some ways, although obviously one would not call chairman of the SEC necessarily a political role. But he's not new to the city and to how agencies work. And so I don't think there'll be many huge surprises. I think you could do a decent amount of due diligence on his leadership style and sort of his priorities. So I do think we'll be able to see that. I think his priorities will very much align with the Biden administration. He is someone who, which is not uncommon to DC, but he is someone who works in the industry that he now regulates. And I think that does afford him a little bit of a perspective, because he did 18 years at Goldman earlier in his career. So it's not to say he's a captured regulator by any means. That was certainly a long time ago, but it does give him the ability to understand the industries he's regulating, to understand Wall Street, and I think to have some appreciation for maybe their side of the debates that he might be entangled in. So I think we'll see, like I said, him being a progressive leader for sure and following along with the priorities of the Biden administration. And we're already seeing that sort of come to fruition already with some of the moves and the pushes he's made, certainly in ESG and other areas that I think we'll just continue to see that.
Well, what are some of the top priorities you've seen so far, Karen?
Well, as I mentioned, ESG is at the forefront of everyone's mind. And Gary Gensler, I think, is someone who is very much animated on pushing those rules. Just this morning or yesterday, he had announced that he would like to see the sort of climate risk ESG rules in place by the end of this year. So at least the proposed rules from the commission. So we obviously see him really leaning on his staff to get those in the works. That obviously I think will be a very important one. It's interesting because ESG, which I know we'll talk about more maybe later, but I would say right now I feel like the sort of trinity of the E and the S and the G, there's a lot of push on the E. I think people see that coming. They understand that a little bit, like climate risk and climate exposure, sustainability efforts seem to be, I think, taking the lead in sort of the umbrella of ESG. So I think we'll see those maybe first. Other top priorities, some of them, have been reactionary, meaning there became priorities in response to something that had happened in the markets. So by that, I mean sort of the meme stocks, the GameStop type ideas. That's obviously something that flares up, and the SEC then has to sort of get involved and then think about how to prevent something like that going forward. So I don't know if I would have said that was a priority as much as it sort of very quickly rose to the top of the agenda. The other things I think will surprise no one when I say cyber, digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, all of that sphere, I think is going to be very much at the top of of the commission's agenda.
Karen, let me turn to some specific topics, and let me start with SPACs, or special purpose acquisition corporations. Where do you see SEC enforcement going around SPACs? Lordstown Motors has had a lot of publicity and has been in the news quite a bit. Could it be a harbinger, or is it really simply just another accounting fraud case?
To answer your question, I don't think the SPAC enforcement actions are going to go away. I think the SEC still very much has that in in their targets. I think Lordstown Motors is an interesting case, but if anything, I think the more recent enforcement action against Stable Road and Momentous merger, what I find interesting about that one, which is different than Lordstown, is that the SEC jumped in and prevented actually the merger. So it was one of the only enforcement actions we've seen that occurred prior to the closing of the proposed business combination. So, and that was about, due diligence and making sure that investors are aware of what, the merger would be. So the reason I think that's more interesting, because to me, it signals that the SEC is taking a hard look at this, and they're taking a hard look in a preventative sort of before the merger is sort of consummated. And that to me seems like they really are prioritizing this. They're not just waiting for the fallout after the fact. They're stepping in earlier. And so whether or not that will be sort of the trend going forward, I'm not sure, but I certainly think it signals that the SEC is taking the SPAC market very seriously and trying to do what they can to protect investors, because the SPAC, by its nature, already is a bit of an end around of the traditional IPO process, which has been stood up in theory to protect the investors that have invested in these companies. So I think the SPAC enforcement actions aren't going to go away. I think there still will be a very hard look at any proposed SPACs going forward. The SPAC market has cooled, it seems, a little bit. I don't think that's entirely from, a harder look from the regulators. I think that's part of it. But I do think it's more that it was such a flooded market that it's a little tricky now for SPACs to find sort of good marriages, sort of good companies that they want to merge with. And so I actually think that that's more of the reason for some of the cooling. It was so flooded that now they're really taking the time trying to find good partners. I mean, that's certainly what we saw even with the Ackman SPAC a few weeks ago. So we'll see. I don't think the SEC is going to take their foot off the gas on SPAC enforcement.
We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with Karen Woody. So do you find that type of preventative approach really consistent with the regulatory schemes that the SEC typically will do in terms of post-action enforcement, or is it well within the wheelhouse of what the SEC can do under the Securities Act of 1933 and 34?
Oh, I love this question, because this really gets me into my speech sometimes about what I see as the role of the commission. And we might get to this too when we talk about enforcement and where enforcement is going. I think some of what is so fascinating about the makeup and the structure of the SEC is that it's in theory, I think initially was supposed to be an agency that wasn't subsumed by enforcement in the way that it is now. And that the enforcement division has just sort of taken over a lot of the agency and has become much more like the DOJ. We see that even with the new enforcement director having been a former, coming straight from being a prosecutor. And so that seems to be the new mode of the SEC, where I think historically, there was more weight or sort of meaning, I guess is the word to use, with divisions like OC, or, where the commission would sort of point out where the guardrails were and sort of help keep companies in line, but without the stick entirely that we see now from enforcement. There was a little bit more of guidance, and that I think the agency has stepped a bit away from. Instead, it does seem more of a, we're coming for you if you screw up, as opposed to, hey, here's some advice or some tips about, after we did some exams, we think there might be some risks here, we're going to tell you. Instead, it's almost like let's see if you screw up and then we're going to come for you. It feels a little bit more like that, with the enforcement division having sort of being the 500-pound gorilla in the room. So that's why I love your question, that this is, to me, it's a combination of the two, which it still is an enforcement action, but it's an enforcement action sort of in almost a preventative way, like, at least for Stable Road, it was a, hey, I don't think this is going to go well. We're going to, but at the same time, it still was a ding on, it still was an enforcement action about due diligence measures. So it's a bit of maybe of a combination. I know that might have been a far afield answer to your question, but I love that concept of, what is the purpose and sort of the structure of the agency, and how it has moved so much, I think, to the reactive sort of ex post sort of view of when people have screwed up, we're going to get them in trouble.
Actually, no, it's exactly the answer I was hoping for us, and we may have to watch that as well down the line. Let me turn to my one of my favorite topics, which of course is FCPA enforcement. We recently had an interesting case involving Tandy Leather, where I'm going to call it non-bribery FCPA enforcement by the SEC under the books and records or internal controls provisions. You and I have looked at some of those cases over the years, and do you think Tandy Leather continues a trend that we've seen? Is it an anomaly, or do we now have enough cases to really think this really is a thing, or where do you see non-bribery FCPA enforcement going?
I absolutely think it's the future of SEC enforcement. In that, I think the SEC is reading 13B2B of the FCPA, the internal controls provision, as being entirely standalone and divorced from the FCPA in terms of the bribery, having anything to do with bribery. I think we will see more and more straight internal controls, linked obviously to accounting measures, books and records. But in theory, I think we will see a lot of those that have nothing to do with foreign bribery. So there'll be a complete sort of split away from the fact that provision of the code rests under a foreign anti-corruption measure. And so I think it's a powerful tool, and the SEC will pick it up and run with it to say, we're going to ding you on internal controls and any that have to do with any sort of part of your organization. We saw that with Andeavor last fall. And then we saw it earlier with the United case, which was an NPA, but still a similar internal controls action that had nothing to do with any sort of foreign transaction or foreign bribery at all. And so I think this very much will be the way that the agency and even the DOJ potentially goes forward with looking at internal controls. So we'll use that provision.
Karen, one other topic in the news continues to be crypto. What, if any, role do you see for the SEC in crypto regulation, whether it's as crypto as a commodity to be invested in, or crypto as some sort of monetary payment system? Is it a financial instrument? Is it something else? Or maybe I should have started with, what's the SEC's role in crypto?
That's another great question. And it is sort of the $64 million run right now, and implicates sort of scope of agency jurisdiction, because if it's a commodity, of course, it should be regulated by the Commodities Futures, the CFTC, Commodities Futures Trading Commission. Gosh, I had to think about that acronym for a minute. But the CFTC has jurisdiction over commodities, and the CFTC and the SEC have sort of parallel tracks, but seem to have been getting closer and closer to each other in what the overlap, if any, of their jurisdictions, and particularly in this area. So is a cryptocurrency a security? Is it a commodity? What's interesting to me is, if it is a security, the test that we have used to define a security is called the Howey test. And it comes out of a case that is nearly 100 years old, and it has to do, with orange groves, and it has nothing to do with crypto, obviously. And so it's, to me, a situation where the principles of that case still hold up, but I do wonder if we almost need a new test, given the new era that we are in. And so to determine if something is a security, the Howey test basically asks if this is, an investment with the expectation of future profits. That is, the profits will come from a common enterprise in which the investor relies on the efforts of a third party, meaning I don't invest money and then I work for the company and hope that it grows. It's a complete sort of passive investment is the definition. And so, like I said, that definition and that test for what a security is has held up for quite some time. But now that we find ourselves in this sort of interesting new world where we have instruments such as crypto, Bitcoin, these things that don't squarely fall under one of these definitions, I do wonder if maybe what we need to do is to then create a new definition, or, without sort of saying, well, I guess this, misses the Howey test on these few aspects. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's time for us to really just sort of decide it is this or that. It is, we will regulate this as a security, or if not, we will regulate this as a commodity. And I think the time we've spent sort of haggling and debating and litigating that question has left more people sort of in the dark and uncertain about the future of this and who regulates it. But I do wonder if maybe we should move past what seems to be some outdated tests to define those things. That's not exactly an answer to your question. I think there certainly is some jockeying between the agencies, SEC and CFTC, to sort of be the prominent regulator of that sphere, because there's so much happening there, and there's obviously such a demand and need for regulation, because people are getting really nervous about the astronomical numbers in those markets. So we will see how I think that ends up.
Karen, are there any other areas that you were looking at from the SEC, either for guidance or enforcement, other than what we've touched on a little bit in this podcast?
It's always an interesting time when there's a new administration to see if things will shift, priorities will shift or not. There's not any other major area that jumps out. I have a personal sort of interest always with my scholarship on things like insider trading, which I think it always proves to be an interesting area of the law and seemingly still dynamic in terms of definitions of what it is. But we do have some movement, actually not from the SEC, but from Congress, to have a more clear statute defining insider trading. So that is an area that I think I will be closely following, especially because we did see another recent case about someone hacking into getting inside information, and how the courts are still sort of doing a lot of gymnastics to help to get to a place where that still counts as insider trading, even though it looks almost more like a straight theft, if anything. So there's a lot in that area that I think is still dynamic and is sort of interesting to keep watching. So that's one area that I personally always have an eye out for. But like I said, I think the crypto area, SPACs, all those, and obviously ESG, those I think will still dominate the headlines for quite some time.
Karen, as we look into the future, do you have an idea of when we might see either Chairman Gensler or the commission itself start to hit its stride under the new administration? Will it be a year? Could it be longer? Would we actually need to wait for a second Biden term if one comes? Or do you really think we might see things in second half of this year?
I think we'll see sort of a quick pace by the SEC under this administration. I think, like I said, Gensler's been in D.C. and has been a commissioner of the CFTC. There's not a lot of, I don't think there'll be a huge learning curve for him. We now have a new enforcement director who I think will have a charge to really come pretty quickly out of the gate, and in a not very cozy relationship, I think, with the white collar bar, the way usually enforcement directors have. A lot of them come straight from a firm or maybe from a bank. And so this is a change in that we have a new enforcement director who's straight from being a prosecutor. So, the Attorney General of New Jersey. So I think the pace will be quick on the SEC hitting a stride and certainly, enforcing its rules to the extent that it feels it can.
Karen, when are we going to see a Karen Woody podcast?
Hopefully soon. I'm trying to get one up and running, and I hope to use some of the amazing human capital of my students to assist with launching it as well. So I hope we will see that in this academic year for sure.
For my next question, I want to give a little background for our listeners. Karen was a guest panelist on the most recent episode of Everything Compliance. And in our Shoutouts and Rants section, she shouted out to Ted Lasso. And her shout out was so passionate. My wife and I sat down and watched the entire first season of Ted Lasso over the weekend. But I wanted to ask you, why do you love Ted Lasso so much?
I mean, how much time do we have? I think it's such a great show. Well, I'm a huge soccer fan, which I know actually is already a cardinal sin to call it soccer when we're talking about Ted Lasso, because the premise of the show is that he becomes a football coach, but in the UK, where obviously that refers to what we call soccer. It is to me just what feels like a diversion from a lot of maybe the other things I'm watching or this or that has a little too much either gore or depression or something. It is such a light, happy show, but with such incredible messages. I feel like it's hard to watch that and not smile. So I've been impressed that it could hold up. I thought it would be fairly one note and a little hokey, but it's actually a really lovely story. So yeah, it's a great diversion from, any other news you might be watching.
Well, the thing that struck me about it was the script writing. The screenwriting. It had some of the most incredible, obscure references that I've heard in screenwriting in quite some time. There was a Meghan Markle reference.
Yeah.
There was Gatesboro, a Baptist church reference. And I'm screaming at my wife, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" And she's like, "What are you talking about? Shut up. I'm watching the show." So it really is just great screenwriting, hilarious acting, as fish out of water as you can get. Some memorable supporting characters. I love Coach and his chess club flings as well. And Nate the Great. I mean, how can you not love Nate the Great?
Awesome.
Anyway, if you haven't watched Ted Lasso, all I can say is go back and watch season 1. Season 2 just started. The only downside is because we watched season 1, we could binge and watch them all the way through. Now that we're on season 2, we have to wait each Friday when another episode drops. So, Karen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I wanted to thank you and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you're interested in history, specifically the Greek and Roman period, I hope you will check out the special podcast series Richard Lummis and I are running on 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. We're taking a look at Plutarch's lives and bringing it forward for leadership lessons for the 21st century. A fascinating series on one of the seminal biography and textbooks of history. If you're interested in history, biography, Greeks or Romans, I know you'll enjoy it. Please check it out.